Hi everyone, my name is Dana Lewis and I'm going to be presenting today about do-it-yourself diabetes, also known as DIY, and why it's not as bananas as you may think. I looked back and on my history of living with diabetes, I've been living with diabetes for 18 years now, since 2002. And pretty much from the first week of living with diabetes, I've been doing it myself. Everything from trying to figure out how to make my meter work for me, which included not using the black textured case that came with my meter, but using a glasses case, which better fit in my bag and was a better pattern and something that actually made me look forward to testing my blood sugar. And things like using the sample vial to hold my test strips instead of using the full vial that held 50 test strips, just because the size of the vial was a little bit smaller. So I've actually been using that same meter and that same vial of sample test strips and refilled it over and over again for the past decade almost. And also things like trying to figure out, how do I exercise and carry low glucose supplies? So in my teens and high school, I was doing things like taking small mints and stuffing them in my sneakers for color guard practice, so that if I couldn't get to my bag with my other low supplies and my juice boxes, I'd be able to start treating my low blood sugar regardless of where I was. So that was back in my early days of living with diabetes, but especially in the last 6 or 7 years, I've taken do-it-yourself diabetes to a new level. Back in 2013, I realized that there were people working on getting data from continuous glucose monitors like the one that I had. And reaching out to those people and asking to use their code, I was able to then build a decision support algorithm to help me decide when and how to take action, and more importantly for me, build a louder alarm system so that I would actually be able to hear the alarms from my CGM. That ultimately led to closing the loop for myself and sharing that with other people, which became known as OpenAPS, or the Open Source Artificial Pancreas System, which is, maybe if you know me, where you know me from. But DIY diabetes really comes from this root of patients having a problem and trying to solve it for themselves. It could be something small, like not liking their meter case or the test strip bottle that they have, or it could be something larger, like not hearing alarms or wanting to improve their automated insulin delivery dosing. There's a lot of things that are happening. But in the course of working in this space, I've done a lot of research. I've talked with a lot of researchers, a lot of clinicians around the world over the last 6 or 7 years. And one of the things that I realized is there's a really disconnect between the patient perspective on DIY diabetes and what clinicians and researchers and regulatory bodies think that DIY diabetes is. And I think one way you can portray it is thinking about a lighthouse at the edge of the cliff. It looks like that's the bleeding edge, right? There's nothing else out there. And so that light is everything there to, warn a ship and make sure it doesn't hit the cliff. But like, that is the edge of land. That's what people think about DIY, that it's bleeding edge, that it's out there, that it's like really, really far out there. But the reality from the patient perspective is usually there's something else out there. There's another bit of land that we're trying to get to, and there's a gap, and we're trying to figure out how to get across the gap. And so that's the difference between a lot of traditional stakeholder perspectives in DIY diabetes and the patient perspective. And it kind of centers on David Hume's is versus ought analogy, where I realize that patients solve a problem. They do it themselves because they think this is the way it ought to be, right? There should be a solution out there that works for me, but if there's not, I'm going to create it myself because I need to solve this problem. Whereas clinicians and researchers are looking at the way healthcare is today. So there's a disconnect between here's what is the way things are today, here's what the standard of care is for diabetes, and there's a gap between where patients think things ought to be, and indeed where some clinicians think things ought to be in the future. And it can be really challenging and frustrating for patients to be innovating and solving their own problems and trying to share it out of the goodness of their heart, because if it works for them, it probably will work for somebody else. And somebody else probably has the same problem. So it's rooted in this problem solving and this sharing of solutions. But it can be really frustrating to be told that you shouldn't be doing that because it's do it yourself, because it's off label, because your doctor didn't tell you to. So sometimes it comes across as, how dare you as a patient do something that you're not told to? And it can be really, really frustrating because some of the things are said with good intentions of wanting to protect patients and protect people. But other times it just falls back on typical things that healthcare people say when it's something that doesn't come from them. And a good analogy to use is to think actually about parachutes. Parachutes, if you jump out of a plane, keep people alive, and that's fairly well known. In fact, there was a study back in 2003 that was looking at Can you use parachute to prevent death? And the answer is yes. But there's been no RCTs ever done on parachute use because nobody's going to agree to jump out of a plane without a parachute. That's just not going to happen. And so people choose to use the parachutes. If they get shoved out of a plane, they try to take a parachute with them. And the conclusion on the study, I think, is really, really relevant to healthcare because it says, as with many interventions intended to prevent ill health, the effectiveness of parachutes has not been subjected to rigorous evaluation by using randomized control trials. So substitute pretty much any DIY solution in, and I've heard that said about that DIY solution. But they also point out that advocates of evidence-based medicine have criticized the adoption of interventions like parachutes that have been evaluated by using only observational data. And we see that happen in diabetes over and over again. But it's not just the newfangled modern 2020 diabetes technology or automated insulin delivery technology that you hear this about. This perspective and this frustration and pushback is a tale as old as time in diabetes, going back as early as the 1970s, when blood glucose testing first became available and first became well known to patients. Patients said, hey, this is great. We should be able to have these meters at home and use them and not just be required to go physically to the hospital or to the doctor's office to find out what our blood sugar is. But there was pushback by clinicians back then who thought, hey, if patients have this, they might take action and harm might befall them. So maybe with some good intentions, but the outcome was it took many more years and it took patients doing it themselves and advocating to change the standard of care to involve blood glucose home testing. And thankfully, when I was diagnosed in 2002, that was the standard of care. But one of the things that I first saw in my diabetes experience as something that was pushed back on by clinicians was continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM. In the early 2000s, these CGMs were not necessarily the most accurate, amazing things, but they could be useful for what they could be useful for, which was alarming if your glucose was suddenly dropping or rising out of bounds and encouraging you to then check your blood sugar if you weren't aware that your blood sugar might be out of range. But if you look back at a lot of the early discussions and the early literature on CGMs, a lot of the language and the discussions focused on clinicians selecting patients who might qualify for CGM and saying that patients who don't like to finger stick and do the home blood glucose testing aren't going to be good candidates for CGM because they might not be compliant and might not be willing to wear CGM. And sure, if you don't use a tool, it probably won't work for you, but that kind of became a push for patients to not be able to access CGM because of the perspective from the clinician on who should actually be able to use it. So of course, fast forward to today, and in the last couple of years, when automated insulin delivery became a thing that patients were able to do themselves because it took so many years for commercial technology to become available. And that's in fact why do-it-yourself closed loops came to be. I built the first one, so I know this well. There was no closed loop available to me, and it took several more years before the first commercial system came out. Now today, there are thousands of people using a multitude of do-it-yourself automated insulin delivery systems very, very safely. And we have the data because I saw early on the pushback from clinicians who said, oh, that's just you. You're just N of 1. And I said, okay, so we gathered data from the community and we shared data that was N of 15, N equals 80, N equals 209. Now there's studies with N equals over 1,000 patients. So you would say, okay, there's data, but why are people still arguing with it? And they are. And it's kind of frustrating, and I think this is what's bananas. But it's not unique to diabetes. I think this is a broader thing we see happening in healthcare. There's the not invented here syndrome, the NIH syndrome, actually, where there's a cultural problem where if something is created from outside, healthcare in general is not really accepting of it. And this is not just true of patient-driven technology and patient-developed technology and DIY things, but it also happens with medical treatments all the time, where clinicians start using something and they find that it works and they start to do the studies and they start to share it, but there is a long history of resistance and pushback until it's adopted as a standard of care. This is everything from things as simple as hand washing and hygiene practices. But there's also a story I hear as a person living with diabetes. I also have celiac, and about 1 in 10 people with diabetes may have celiac disease, so it's pretty fairly common. But it wasn't until recently that I actually heard the story of some of the early treatments of celiac disease. There were a clinician who realized that these patients were malnourished, had GI issues, were not doing well, but when he put them on a diet of a lot of bananas, these patients stopped dying. And so the cure for celiac was seen to be the banana diet. And patients were asked to eat 200 bananas a week. And if they did okay with that, they were able to go home and continue with their banana diet. Well, in World War II, there was another clinician who saw that bread was no longer available due to restrictions from the war. And patients who would otherwise be developing celiac disease or having problems with celiac disease stopped having issues because they were no longer eating bread. And so the clinician hypothesized there was something in bread that was actually causing the issues of celiac disease. And that was the precursor for the discovery of gluten being the thing that causes the celiac disease problems. And unfortunately, that early clinician who started the banana diet didn't believe that it was gluten causing the problems. He thought that bananas were the cure for celiac disease. And so I think there's a lesson for us in diabetes and in modern healthcare to recognize that just because there's something that kind of works doesn't mean it's the only solution, doesn't mean the mechanism of understanding for that is correct for like why that solution works. Definitely doesn't mean that it's the best solution, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have quality of life side effects for the patient. And that's something that we have to think about. And when you look at the why of people doing DIY, it's not to fight the industry, it's not to push back at their doctors, it's because they have a problem and they're trying to solve it. And they're solving it through unconventional means because there wasn't a solution that their doctor could provide them, or it wasn't financially feasible for them, or it wasn't provided by healthcare insurance, or it in fact just doesn't exist yet. So when we talk about DIY diabetes in the context of where do we go and what do we do, I think we have to stop and recognize that open source and DIY technologies, or DIY anything in diabetes, and commercial solutions are not conflicting paths. We're all on the same page here. We're all trying to solve the similar problems, but we do it in different ways. And so I think there's a couple of take-home lessons that we can learn from this. First and foremost is recognizing that commercial can in fact build solutions coming from DIY. There are countless examples where patients have solved a problem themselves and started to build community demand for that, which turns into market share for a commercial product. And in fact, there's things like Night Scout that were created to solve a problem around remote monitoring of blood glucose data. And there's such demand there. So that's why a lot of the companies have hopefully started and will continue to do remote monitoring of patient CGM data. But there's still challenges with that. You still see concerns kind of harkening back to the 1970s about patients might do something with their data with finger stick monitoring. Well, that's still true with CGM data today. And companies and the regulatory bodies say, well, we don't want you to be able to display your data on any device because what if there's a lag? What if there's a delay? What if something goes wrong? Will the average patient know how to deal with that or know how to check if the data is up to date? And so far, the easiest solution has been to cut off access from that data from devices or apps that haven't been approved for using or displaying that data. And it kind of makes sense, but it kind of still feels patriarchal and saying, hey, patients, you can't use your data for taking care of yourself and living your life. So that still happens. But there are more positive examples of where commercial is building from DIY, even in the automated insulin delivery space. You'll hear Eric Honecker of Diaboloop talking about his experience with Diaboloop of hearing about OpenAPS, deciding to port the code in and test it and run it side by side with the algorithm that they had been developing for their commercial product, and realizing there were cases where OpenAPS had really good ideas for safety engineering and those kind of edge cases of what if something bad happens. And so they pulled some of those ideas in and built a safety layer so that their algorithm is then checked against the OpenAPS safety layer. And that's used to then determine insulin dosing. And so I think he says about 10% of the time, a patient running their system is actually getting decision support coming from the ideas from OpenAPS, which I think is a fantastic example of how DIY innovations can be used by commercial entities. And in fact, when you look at DIY stuff that's then made open source, it's usually licensed freely to allow companies and individuals to use the code freely. So that's a great example of commercial building from DIY and using something that started with DIY N of one. It's something that I built for me, those safety guards. We then shared it with the community, and now companies are able to take advantage of that too, which is fantastic. But the other option we can do is to work together. There's countless examples of many companies now hiring people from the diabetes community who've worked on their own DIY solution to work on a similar version at the commercial company, which is one great option. There's also plenty of ways that companies can work with patients in the community without having to hire the person full-time in a job, and that's great. But I think kind of the premise is there's a bunch of different ways that we can work together, but it involves starting to have the conversation about why these solutions exist and how a commercial entity or a researcher can work with a patient to kind of bring the best of that idea to a wider market. I think that's really important. And something else that we can do too is hand off ideas from the DIY community to researchers. For example, I have data that we've collected from the community because I saw that all of this amazing data from patients who are doing DIY things, whether it's DIY CGM receivers or DIY automated insulin delivery, you name it, there's a bunch of really rich data from patients in the real world that the traditional healthcare system has no way to capture and no way to use that data. So we've created a data commons to allow ourselves to analyze pooled data and test our solutions against that. But that data is also available to researchers. So researchers can in fact request access to this data and use it to answer questions and come up with new solutions and test their solutions against real world, real people data that has things like CGM sensors falling out or your insulin pump site falling out and menstruation and pregnancy and kids with growth spurts and you name it, that exists in this data set. But one of the things that I've seen from looking at this data set myself is recognizing that we've solved a bunch of big problems in diabetes. And now that we have this data from the solutions from these big problems, we can now turn our attention to some smaller problems that are like the last mile problems of looking at how do we optimize which type of insulin somebody could use to get the best results with their automated insulin delivery system, or understanding when somebody's pump site is dying and the insulin no longer is becoming effective, looking at where somebody is getting great placement and activity from their insulin from the pump site location, or recognizing that, hey, you keep placing your pump site in this one location, it doesn't seem to be working well, it might be time to give that site a break. And looking at things like noise and CGM sensor, or looking at best strategies for exercise after meals, and looking at, indeed, mealtime insulin dosing and strategies for handling different types of food and different types of diet choices that people might make. There's really, really powerful things we can do to continue to improve the lives of people living with diabetes if we partner with that data and with researchers who can help us start to answer some of those questions. But we also know that clinicians also can leverage DIY knowledge. And in fact, one thing that I don't think we talk about enough when we talk about DIY diabetes is recognizing that clinicians do a lot of off-label things all the time, that when they do it, is called off-label usage of a drug or a device or a therapy or a treatment. When patients do it themselves, it's called DIY, but it's the same thing. It's trying something that's maybe not approved yet for that use, but could potentially be effective. And so clinicians have a lot of that knowledge that actually comes from patients. So when they do it, it's called off-label. When patients do it, it's called DIY. And so we're actually doing a lot more of the same thing. And that's one thing that I hope we recognize in the discussions about DIY and the future of diabetes. I'm always struck by a story that I heard of John F. Kennedy, one of the US presidents, who toured NASA back in the day when they were working to develop spacecraft that could go to the moon and go to space. And I heard the story of John F. Kennedy touring NASA, and he stopped and asked a janitor, somebody who cleans, and says, well, what do you do? And the response was, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And that story is used to talk about a mission that everybody who works for an organization can align to. But I think it's a really powerful story and analogy that we can use in healthcare, and recognizing that we're all on the same team. We are all on the same mission, which is to help improve the lives of people with diabetes. And that's why I do DIY diabetes. When I have problems, I want to solve them myself. But I recognize that there might be somebody else out there. Could be one, could be 100, could be hundreds of thousands of people who have the same problem. And I want to share something in hopes that they will be able to use it. Clinicians, too, are trying to help people with diabetes live better lives and be healthy and be safe and stay alive. Guess what? Regulatory bodies also trying to help people with diabetes live healthy lives and stay safe. Companies are working on solutions to help improve the lives of people with diabetes. So that's our mission. It's a shared mission. So the future, I think, of DIY, do-it-yourself diabetes, is continuing to work together. Whether you're a clinician, a researcher, somebody who works for a company, or at the regulatory body, you have to remember this quote from Margaret Mead that says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So think about this in terms of healthcare. It will only take a small group of us, no matter where we sit in healthcare, patient, provider, researcher, industry. We can change diabetes, but we can't wait. We can't afford to wait. And that's why we, patients, are doing this. This is why we're doing DIY. We're not waiting because we can't afford to wait. And so I hope as we talk about DIY, I hope you join us in saying we are not waiting either. Thank you.